What if I told you that the glossy, polished image of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle as doting parents in their Montecito mansion might not be the full story? What if, behind those carefully staged photographs, the smiling walkabouts, and the Netflix-crafted fairy tale, there was a much darker reality? A reality so troubling that even those closest to the Sussexes could no longer keep silent. This isn't just gossip whispered in tabloids. This is testimony. And it comes from the very person who had a front-row seat to the chaos, their nanny. From the very first words she shared, the account was laced with something raw, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. She didn't just hint at strictness or eccentric parenting styles. She described something far more chilling. She used words that sent shivers down the spine, words that painted an entirely different picture of Harry and Meghan's domestic life. She said they beat them like snakes. Let that sink in. Beat them like snakes. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What does that mean? Is it before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates metaphor? Is it literal? And why would someone entrusted with caring for children resort to such a disturbing turn of phrase unless the reality had shaken her to the core? This story matters because it cuts through the PR facade. It pierces the illusion that has been carefully woven by Harry and Meghan since the day they broke away from the royal family. For years, the narrative has been tightly controlled. A couple who stood against the establishment, who fought for independence, who wanted nothing more than to raise their children in peace and privacy. Yet, if the nanny's words hold even a fraction of truth, then that entire story collapses into dust. Now, before we dive into the details, let's ask the uncomfortable question. Why would anyone stay silent if children were truly at risk? Could fear have played a role? Fear of powerful lawyers, fear of public backlash, fear of being branded a liar in a world where image is everything? Or maybe, just maybe, the truth was too disturbing to confront head-on. The introduction of this nanny's perspective doesn't just throw a shadow over Harry and Meghan as parents. It raises an even bigger issue. The responsibility that comes with power and fame. The world watched Diana with Harry and William. We saw tenderness, laughter, motherly affection. We saw children raised with some semblance of normalcy amidst unimaginable pressure. And now, decades later, are we expected to believe that her son, the very one who once stood as a beacon of resilience after her death, has become part of a household where accusations of cruelty can even exist? Think about it. Harry positioned himself as the rebel prince who wanted to protect his family from the very forces that destroyed his mother. He claimed he wanted a better life for Archie and Lilibet, away from royal rigidity, away from the flashbulbs of paparazzi, away from the suffocating rules of the monarchy. Yet here we are, faced with allegations that suggest a home more suffocating than any palace. Isn't that the ultimate contradiction? Isn't that the most gut-wrenching irony of all? Let's not forget Meghan's role in this crafted narrative. She has been painted as the mother fighting for her children's freedom. In interviews, she spoke about protecting Archie's skin color from cruel speculation. She described motherhood as both a joy and a challenge. But if the nanny's testimony is true, then what Meghan presented to the world was a carefully constructed shield, a performance that hid the reality within. And here lies the real tragedy. The children. Innocent, voiceless, caught in the middle of an image war that their parents are determined to win at any cost. The nanny's words don't just shine a light on Harry and Meghan's alleged parenting. They scream of betrayal, the betrayal of innocence, of trust, of what family is supposed to mean. So why does this matter now? Why does it matter in 2025, when the couple has already stepped away from royal duties, when they live thousands of miles away from Buckingham Palace, when they insist they just want privacy? It matters because the mask appears to be slipping. The story matters because the people who once protected their image are no longer willing to stay silent. And when silence breaks, it breaks for a reason. Consider the timing. The Sussexes are not just a family, they are a brand. A multi-million-dollar brand built on the foundation of victimhood and resilience. Their deals with Netflix, Spotify, and publishers rely on their credibility as truth-tellers. But how credible can they remain if those who lived with them, who saw the day-to-day reality, are coming forward with testimonies of dysfunction, cruelty, and fear? And if we take a step further, What does this mean for the monarchy itself? Harry may have turned his back on the crown, but his actions and reputation still cast a shadow over the family he left behind. Every scandal attached to him, every accusation, becomes a weapon used against the royal family as a whole. Isn't that why the palace watches in silence, never commenting directly, but always maneuvering behind the scenes? Could it be that even they know what has been whispered for years? You see, this isn't just another sensational headline. It's a story that challenges everything we thought we knew about the Sussexes. And it's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about fame, family, and the masks we wear to survive. Now, let me ask you this. Do you believe the carefully curated image, or do you believe the words of someone who lived it? Someone who risked her livelihood, her safety, and her reputation to speak the truth? Because in a world where narratives are bought and sold, truth becomes the most dangerous currency of all. And just when you think you've heard the worst of it, just when you think the revelations couldn't possibly get darker, wait until you hear what the nanny says about Prince Harry's temper, Meghan's suffocating control, and the night that left the household shattered forever. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What is a palace without its walls of gold? What is a mansion without its shining facade? That's the question the nanny forced us to confront when she pulled back the curtain on life inside Montecito. From the outside, the Sussex estate gleams like a modern castle. $14 million of sunlit luxury, manicured lawns, towering palms swaying against California skies. To the casual eye, it looks like the dream Harry and Meghan promised: freedom, privacy, peace. But according to the nanny, step inside those walls, and the dream disintegrates into something far darker. She described her first days there as disorienting. At first glance, everything was perfect. She was shown the children's rooms, their toys arranged in meticulous order, little outfits lined up as if for a catalog photo shoot. But something gnawed at her. There was no warmth. Have you ever walked into a space that felt staged, like a showroom, rather than a home lived in by children? That's what she said it felt like. A set. An illusion. The nanny noticed silence where laughter should have been. Archie, old enough to giggle and chatter, was quiet. Lilibet, a toddler at the time, seemed withdrawn. Were they shy? Or had they been conditioned to be still? The nanny wasn't sure. But the absence of joy weighed on her from the very beginning. She said Meghan treated the mansion as though it were her kingdom. Rules were carved into stone. No toy out of place. No spontaneous play without permission. Even mealtimes, she explained, were scheduled down to the minute. The children could not simply ask for a snack. Everything had to be approved, logged, timed. Does that sound like freedom to you? Harry, on the other hand, was described as the opposite: chaotic, impulsive, often undoing Meghan's rigidity with his sudden bursts of temper. If Meghan was ice, Harry was fire. Together, they created a climate of tension, and the children were the ones who felt it most. The nanny recalled that staff walked on eggshells. Imagine this: a sprawling estate filled with servants, assistants, security. Yet everyone moved quietly, voices hushed, footsteps careful, as if afraid to disturb an invisible monster lurking behind the next door. One slip, one mistake, could set off a storm. And storms in that house didn't blow over. They lingered. She recounted the first time she saw Harry lose his composure. It was over something small, almost laughably so. A misplaced toy. Archie had left it in the living room, and Meghan frowned. Harry snapped. His voice rose, echoing through the halls. The nanny said she froze, not because of the shouting itself. Parents argue, parents get angry, but because of the look in Archie's eyes. Wide, startled, fearful. Children know when anger isn't just discipline. Children know when it's dangerous. And here's where the contradictions hit hardest. Harry was the one who spoke endlessly about breaking cycles of trauma. He admitted to struggling with anger, to seeking therapy, to fighting the shadow of Diana's tragic death. Yet inside that mansion, in front of his own children, he unleashed the very same rage he once claimed had haunted him. Isn't that the cruelest twist of fate? To run from the demons of your past only to become them? The nanny described moments that felt surreal. Meghan would host meetings with staff about the children's schedules, talking about mindfulness, yoga, and organic diets. She would preach about balance and love. Then, hours later, the very same children would be subjected to harsh scoldings that stripped them of comfort. The gap between words and actions wasn't just wide, it was cavernous. One story she told painted the entire picture. Meghan had insisted on a mindfulness exercise for Archie. A child, barely old enough to understand meditation, was made to sit still in silence. The nanny watched as Archie squirmed, restless as any child would be. Meghan grew cold, insisting he try harder. Harry walked in, already tense, and instead of easing the moment, he snapped at both of them, the child and the nanny, for failing to maintain control. Can you imagine? A toddler punished for not being enlightened enough. That's not mindfulness. That's madness. But what really unnerved the nanny wasn't just the control. It was the atmosphere of fear. Staff feared Meghan's perfectionism. They feared Harry's outbursts. And the children, according to her, were learning to fear their parents. Silence became their shield. Stillness became their only way to stay safe. And that, she said, was the moment she knew something was profoundly wrong. She compared it to living in a gilded cage. From the outside, glittering beauty. On the inside, suffocating restraint. Have you ever wondered how much pressure it takes before something cracks? Before the silence shatters? That's the question that haunted the nanny as she went about her duties, watching the family unravel piece by piece. Because while the walls of Montecito stood tall, protecting the Sussexes from the world outside, within those walls lay a storm brewing stronger each day. The nanny saw the smiles at public events, the polished photographs, the staged walks to school. And then she returned home with them, where the truth revealed itself in whispered arguments, slammed doors, and children hiding behind their toys. The contradiction was unbearable. Meghan, the champion of compassion, lecturing the world about kindness, yet showing little to those under her roof. Harry, the self-proclaimed protector of his children, yet raising his voice in ways that left them trembling. The staff, hired to support, living like shadows in the home, avoiding attention just to survive another day. And just when the nanny thought she had seen it all, just when she thought the worst was Meghan's cold perfectionism or Harry's sudden rages, something happened that shook her to her core. A moment that would redefine everything she thought she knew about this family. Because what she witnessed next wasn't just about control. It wasn't just about fear. It was about something much darker. And it began with Harry's temper. Have you ever seen someone go from calm to volcanic in a matter of seconds? That's how the nanny described Prince Harry inside Montecito. It wasn't just irritation. It wasn't just the stress of fatherhood. It was something deeper, something rawer, something that erupted without warning. She called it explosive, and not without reason. The first time it happened, she thought it was a bad day. Everyone has those, right? Maybe Harry was tired. Maybe the pressure of paparazzi rumors, Netflix deals, or endless public criticism had gotten to him. But then it happened again, and again. Each time, the fuse grew shorter, the blast more violent. And each time, the children watched. Silent. Frozen. The nanny painted a picture of Harry pacing, fists clenched, voice booming through the mansion's marble halls. His face would redden, his jaw tighten, his words cut like knives. And what triggered these moments? Not world crises. Not monumental betrayals. No. Something as small as Archie spilling juice on the carpet. Something as ordinary as Lilibet crying at the wrong time. Something as human as a nanny asking a question that challenged his authority. Can you imagine living in a house where a spilled drink feels like a declaration of war? Where the smallest mistake could unleash an avalanche of rage. And here's the contradiction. Publicly, Harry speaks of trauma, of therapy, of breaking cycles. He insists he wants to protect his children from the very kind of household he endured. But according to the nanny, he became the storm he claimed to escape. That's the tragedy, isn't it? The man who vowed to protect his family ended up being the one they needed protection from. The nanny described one night in vivid detail. Harry had been drinking, not excessively, but enough to loosen the edges of restraint. Archie wanted to play past bedtime, just an innocent request. A child's plea for one more story, one more toy, one more moment of light before darkness. Instead of laughter or compromise, the request set Harry off. His voice thundered. The nanny recalled Archie's small body shrinking into itself, shoulders curling as if bracing for impact. What does that do to a child? What does it do to their spirit when joy becomes a trigger for punishment? The nanny couldn't forget the look on Meghan's face during these explosions. Sometimes she remained icy, detached, as if observing from a distance. Other times, she stoked the fire, criticizing Harry in front of the children, escalating the chaos rather than calming it. Rarely, if ever, did she step in to comfort the little ones. Was that neglect? Was it strategy? Or was it simply her way of maintaining control? The staff whispered about these tempers too. Security guards exchanged wary glances. Housekeepers scurried out of rooms at the first sign of raised voices. Assistants grew adept at predicting when Harry's mood would sour. They called it the storm cycle. Calm before, explosion during, tension after, and then silence. The silence that suffocated. And silence, the nanny said, was worse than the shouting. After the eruptions came stretches of eerie quiet, as if the entire house held its breath, waiting for the next outburst. Archie and Lilibet learned to mirror that silence. They tiptoed. They avoided questions. They sat too still for children their age. Do you see the pattern? Children learning not to be children. But perhaps the most unsettling part came not from Harry's rage, but from his justification afterward. According to the nanny, he often excused himself by citing his past. I can't help it, he'd mutter. You don't know what I've been through. It was as if his own trauma became a license to inflict fear on others. Isn't that the ultimate betrayal of healing? To weaponize your pain instead of resolving it? And yet, here's where the emotional contradiction twists again. Harry could also swing to the opposite extreme. After an explosion, he would sometimes break down in tears. The nanny recalled one occasion where, after terrifying his son with screaming, Harry sat alone in the garden, head in his hands, sobbing quietly. She felt pity then, genuine pity, because it wasn't just cruelty she saw. It was a man shattered, trapped between the boy who lost his mother and the father who didn't know how to love without hurting. But pity, she admitted, didn't erase the damage. Children don't see broken men wrestling with grief. They see a father whose love feels dangerous, unpredictable. They see fear where there should be safety. And it didn't stop there. The nanny shared that Harry's temper wasn't only directed at his children. Staff bore the brunt too. A forgotten errand, a poorly prepared meal, a scheduling mistake. Each became grounds for shouting matches that left seasoned professionals shaken. One driver, she said, refused to return after being berated over something as small as taking the wrong route. Staff turnover became common, the revolving doors spinning faster with each eruption. Now, ask yourself, why would a household with so much privilege, wealth, and supposed freedom feel like a place of fear? Shouldn't those children be the happiest, safest in the world? And yet, the nanny's words suggest the opposite. Still, nothing prepared her for the day Harry's temper collided with Meghan's cold discipline. Because when fire meets ice, the result isn't balance. It's devastation. That day would mark the nanny forever. It was the day she stopped believing this was just stress, just celebrity pressure, just ordinary parenting struggles. It was the day she realized something much more sinister was happening. And that's where Meghan's regime entered the story. What happens when discipline stops being guidance and becomes control? That was the question the nanny asked herself the longer she stayed inside Montecito. If Harry's temper was fire, unpredictable, explosive, destructive, then Meghan's parenting style was ice. Cold, sharp, suffocating. The nanny said it was as if every moment of the children's lives had been drafted like a military schedule, with no room for spontaneity, no space for them to simply be children. She described Meghan's regime in one word: rigid. Every detail was orchestrated. Wake-up times, meal times, nap times, even playtimes, all locked into schedules that could not be broken. Imagine a toddler being told that laughter, running, or play had to fit into a 30-minute block penciled into a color-coded calendar. Does that sound like childhood to you? Or like a training exercise? The nanny recalled how Meghan demanded perfection in ways that bordered on the absurd. Toys had to be returned to shelves in exact positions. Outfits had to match color schemes chosen in advance. Even meals had to adhere to strict dietary rules. No processed foods. No treats. No exceptions. Meghan would lecture staff about the importance of mindfulness and wellness while denying her children the simple joys of being children. How many of us remember sticky fingers from ice cream cones, or giggling at bedtime when we were supposed to be asleep? For Archie and Lilibet, those moments were forbidden luxuries. The nanny noticed something chilling in Meghan's tone. She rarely raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her power was in her precision. When a child disobeyed, even in the smallest way, Meghan's response was icy disapproval. Her eyes hardened. Her voice dropped to a slow, deliberate cadence that froze the room. For a child, that kind of cold silence can sting worse than a shout. And it wasn't just occasional, it was constant. Do you know what it does to a child when they are conditioned to see love as conditional? When affection is a reward, not a given. The nanny saw it in Archie's posture, in the way Lilibet clutched her toys like lifelines. She said the children were learning early that approval came only through obedience. That's not nurturing. That's indoctrination. The contradictions here were staggering. Meghan, who built a brand on compassion, equality, and authenticity, was in reality, according to the nanny, a perfectionist who suffocated her own children with impossible standards. She told the world she wanted them free from the rigidity of the monarchy. Yet at home, she created a system far stricter than anything Kensington could have devised. Isn't that the cruelest irony? To escape the crown only to build a harsher one inside your own home? And then came the punishments. Not physical, not in the way tabloids like to exaggerate, but psychological. When Archie resisted his strict bedtime, Meghan wouldn't simply scold him. She would withdraw attention. She would ignore him completely, pretending he wasn't even in the room. Can you imagine being a child, desperate for love, met only with a wall of silence? That's the kind of absence that cuts deeper than words. The nanny remembered a particularly haunting moment. Archie had colored outside the lines of a drawing, a simple mistake for any child. Meghan looked at the page, frowned, and told him he needed to try again properly. No smile. No encouragement. Just criticism. The boy's face, the nanny said, fell in a way that pierced her heart. And the worst part? He quietly took the paper, started over, and said nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't pout. He just obeyed. Too quiet. Too compliant. Too broken for a child his age. And what about Lilibet? The nanny said Meghan's expectations of her were just as harsh, if not harsher. Because she was the only daughter, Meghan seemed to mold her into a reflection of herself. Outfits styled to mirror Meghan's own wardrobe. Social interactions curated to impress. Even the way Lilibet spoke was corrected, polished, rehearsed. Childhood spontaneity erased for the sake of an image. Now let's ask the question, why? Why would Meghan, who publicly championed freedom, demand such suffocating control behind closed doors? Was it insecurity? A need to prove herself superior to the royal machine she escaped? Or was it simple obsession with perfection, driven by an image she couldn't afford to let slip? The nanny believed it was both. Meghan wanted the children to be extensions of her brand. Perfect, polished, enviable. Every photo, every anecdote, every staged moment was another brick in the empire she was building. And anything less than perfection threatened to unravel it all. But perfection is impossible. And the cracks always show. The nanny recalled that Archie sometimes rebelled in small ways. He'd hide toys under his bed, whisper jokes when he was supposed to be quiet, sneak a cookie when no one was watching. Small, harmless acts of defiance. And yet, when Meghan discovered them, she responded with icy lectures about respect, rules, and appearances. To her, even the smallest crack in order was a betrayal. And this is where Harry's temper collided with Meghan's rigidity. If Archie resisted, Meghan demanded obedience. If he still faltered, Harry's temper flared. Fire and ice. The child was caught between the two extremes, frozen by Meghan, scorched by Harry. What kind of childhood is that? The nanny said the tension built like a ticking bomb. She described nights when Meghan would scold Harry for being too harsh, only to later criticize him for being too lenient. Harry, already volatile, would explode under the pressure. The children sat silently through these battles, too afraid to move, too conditioned to escape. The atmosphere became unbearable, and the nanny knew that something was bound to break. And then it did. Because one evening, after a particularly strict day under Meghan's regime, Archie made a mistake so small it should have been laughable. Instead, it became the spark that ignited everything. That was the night the nanny first heard the chilling phrase, "Beat them like snakes." And nothing was ever the same again. Have you ever heard a phrase so jarring, so brutal, that it lodges itself in your memory and refuses to leave? That's what the nanny said happened when she first heard the words, beat them like snakes. Those 4 words shattered whatever illusions she still had about Harry and Meghan's parenting. They weren't whispers. They weren't rumors. They came from the nanny's own observation, her own interpretation of the way discipline unfolded inside that Montecito mansion. And once she said it out loud, the world as she knew it would never look at that household the same way again. At first, she thought it was an exaggeration her own mind had created to cope with what she was witnessing. But the more she replayed the moments, the more the metaphor made sense. Why snakes? Because, according to her, the punishments carried out by Harry and Meghan weren't the ordinary consequences of childhood disobedience. They were fierce. They were venomous. They were delivered with the kind of relentless intensity one might use when battling an enemy rather than guiding a child. The nanny said it was as if Harry and Meghan didn't see their children as innocent, but as obstacles to be controlled, subdued, conquered. Picture this. Archie drops a toy car down the staircase. To most parents, it's a moment of clumsiness, maybe a teaching opportunity about safety. But in that mansion, the nanny said it was treated like betrayal. Harry's voice would thunder, Meghan's icy stare would cut, and the child would shrink under the weight of it. Like snakes, the nanny said. As if the children's mistakes were dangerous fangs that had to be beaten down before they could strike again. It wasn't just the punishment itself, it was the ritual around it. The nanny noticed how Harry and Meghan often acted in tandem. Harry would lash out with words, sometimes with slamming doors or fists pounding tables, while Meghan would deliver the cold verdict afterward. Long silences, disapproving looks, and withdrawal of affection. One parent would erupt, the other would freeze. Together, they created a cycle of punishment that felt endless. And the children? They were caught in the middle, trapped in a system they couldn't escape. Let's pause for a second. Think about the irony here. Harry and Meghan built their entire brand on the idea of breaking free from cruelty, escaping toxicity, and creating a safe haven for their family. Yet what the nanny described sounds like the very thing they claim to run from. Isn't that the ultimate contradiction? The people who fled the palace claiming victimhood allegedly became the tyrants of their own castle. The nanny said the phrase, beat them like snakes, didn't always mean physical strikes. Sometimes it was about repetition. The children were scolded over and over for the same small act until they broke down in tears. Sometimes it was about isolation, being sent to their rooms for hours, not allowed to join play, not allowed to speak until they complied. And sometimes, yes, there were slaps on the hand, sharp yanks of an arm, or a shove back into place. Small, quick, but laced with enough fury to send the message. Disobedience will not be tolerated. But here's the most unsettling part. The nanny said the punishments didn't always match the offense. In fact, most of the time, they didn't. It wasn't about teaching lessons. It was about maintaining control. Whether Archie refused a vegetable or Lilibet cried too loudly, the response was disproportionate, delivered with venom, like striking at snakes. The children weren't being guided. They were being subdued. And yet, just as in previous chapters, the contradictions never stopped. There were moments of tenderness, moments when Harry would scoop up his children with tears in his eyes, moments when Meghan would post a photo of smiling faces and call them her joy. Those moments confused the nanny most. Because how do you reconcile them? How do you trust the authenticity of love shown in public when it collides so violently with cruelty shown in private? She said the confusion extended to the staff as well. One housekeeper whispered to her one evening, "It feels like they don't know whether they want to love their kids or punish them." That was the tragedy. The children never knew which version of their parents they would get. Would it be the smiling faces for the camera, or the serpent slayers behind closed doors? The nanny recalled one specific incident that still haunted her. Archie had drawn on the wall with crayons. A classic childhood mischief. Instead of laughter or gentle correction, Harry erupted. His voice echoed through the hall, a storm breaking loose. Meghan stood beside him, arms crossed, face like stone. Together, they scolded Archie until his small hands trembled, the crayons slipping from his fingers. The nanny said she could see the boy's spirit dim in that moment, as though the light inside him had been snuffed. And all she could think of was that chilling phrase, "Beat them like snakes." And then there was Lilibet. The nanny said Meghan was especially strict with her. Perhaps because she was the only daughter, perhaps because Meghan saw her as an extension of her own legacy. Whatever the reason, the punishments were harsher. Meghan demanded perfection, perfect posture, perfect speech, perfect manners. When Lilibet stumbled, the consequences were swift. One evening, when she mispronounced a word in front of visitors, Meghan's smile froze into fury the moment the guests left. The nanny said she will never forget the icy reprimand that followed, Lilibet's little shoulders trembling under the weight of her mother's wrath. So why does this matter? Why should we believe the nanny's account? Because these aren't the words of a tabloid gossip. These are the words of someone who lived inside those walls, who saw the children every day, who witnessed the cycle of fire and ice with her own eyes. And whether you believe her or not, one thing is undeniable. No nanny would risk everything to share a story this disturbing unless she truly believed the world needed to hear it. But here's where the story twists again. Because the nanny said it wasn't just the children who endured this snake-beating style of discipline. The staff themselves, those paid to serve, protect, and care, also felt the sting of Harry and Meghan's wrath. And when adults begin whispering in fear, when workers begin to scatter like shadows at the sound of footsteps, you know the problem runs far deeper than parenting style. Because in Montecito, the fear wasn't limited to children. It spread to everyone. And soon, the entire household was living under the same regime of terror. What does it say about a home when even the adults are afraid? That was the question the nanny asked herself every single day she worked inside Montecito. Because according to her, fear didn't stop at the children's bedrooms. It seeped into every hallway, every kitchen, every staff room. The entire household lived under a cloud of tension. Imagine working in a mansion where your job isn't just to clean, cook, or drive, but to survive the moods of those who employed you. That's what staff whispered among themselves. They weren't just employees. They were soldiers in an invisible war, dodging tempers, appeasing egos, and praying not to be noticed at the wrong time. The nanny said it was like walking on glass. Every step had to be careful. Every word had to be measured. If you spoke too loudly, you risked being accused of disturbing Meghan's quiet time. If you moved too slowly, you risked Harry accusing you of laziness. There was no winning. Every action was wrong. Every moment was a test. And the staff began to notice a pattern. Harry's outbursts were loud, sudden, fiery. Meghan's control was icy, calculated, humiliating. Together, they created an atmosphere where no one felt safe. One day, a gardener accidentally trimmed a hedge shorter than Meghan liked. He was reprimanded, not once, not twice, but for days, cold reminders, subtle digs, endless corrections. Another time, a housekeeper left a towel folded in the wrong direction. Harry screamed at her in the hallway, his voice so loud that the children woke crying. The woman left the job within a week, longer than a few months. The mansion, with all its grandeur, became a revolving door of frightened employees. The nanny said she lost count of how many faces came and went, each one broken a little more by the atmosphere of fear that clung to the Montecito estate like a shadow. One former chef, she recalled, left after a screaming match over breakfast. Meghan had demanded an entirely new menu to match the latest wellness trend she'd read about. Gluten-free, sugar-free, oil-free meals prepared on demand. The chef, exhausted after weeks of impossible requests, forgot one minor detail: almond milk instead of oat milk in Harry's morning smoothie. Harry's response? A tirade so vicious the chef packed up his knives and walked out the same day. Can you imagine? Years of training, reduced to ashes over a splash of milk. It wasn't just shouting, either. Meghan had her own weapon: humiliation. Staff described how she would call them out in front of others for mistakes, no matter how small. A nanny holding the wrong type of baby bottle. A cleaner using the wrong polish on a table. A driver taking a route Meghan hadn't approved. Instead of quiet correction, Meghan made an example of them. Cold words. Piercing stares. A tone so cutting that even seasoned staff crumbled. And here's the chilling part: the children watched. They saw adults shrink under their parents' power. They saw grown men and women, hardened by years of service in royal households or elite mansions, reduced to silence in seconds. What lesson does that teach a child? That authority is meant to be feared, not respected. That love is conditional. That kindness is weakness. The nanny admitted she often felt torn. She wanted to protect the children, but how could she when the entire house was built on control and punishment? She tried to soften moments, to sneak in laughter, to comfort them when Harry and Meghan weren't looking. But the staff whispered warnings to her. Careful. If they think you're undermining them, you'll be gone. The fear wasn't just for their jobs. It was for their reputations. Meghan, after all, had powerful lawyers. Harry had a name that could crush anyone in the press. Who would believe the staff over the Sussexes? One night, the nanny overheard a conversation among two housekeepers in the staff quarters. They spoke in hushed tones, voices trembling. "It feels like we're prisoners here," one said. "Every day I wake up wondering if today is the day I'll be shouted at, humiliated, or fired." The other nodded, whispering, "It's like a war zone. You never know where the next explosion will come from." And the explosions did come. The nanny remembered one particular evening when Harry lost his temper with a security guard. The guard had failed to recognize a delivery van and delayed its entry by a few minutes. Harry stormed outside, shouting in the driveway, his words echoing through the night. The guard stood frozen, shoulders squared but eyes filled with quiet shame. The children were upstairs at the window, watching. The nanny saw them. She saw Archie clutch his sister's hand, both staring silently as their father berated a grown man. That image stayed with her, small children watching big fear. The staff tried to cope in their own ways. Some became invisible, moving silently like shadows. Others hardened, showing no emotion, hoping detachment would protect them. But the cracks always showed. Tears in the laundry room, frustrated whispers in the kitchen, quick exits through back doors when the pressure grew too much. And then there were the secrets. The nanny learned that staff began covering for each other, hiding mistakes, and protecting one another from Meghan's cold wrath or Harry's fiery temper. They developed a silent code, warning each other with looks, hand signals, anything to avoid being caught in the storm. Can you imagine? A multi-million-dollar estate running like a covert operation, not because of security threats from the outside, but because of the explosive danger from within. The irony is almost unbearable. Meghan and Harry publicly declared they wanted to escape the toxic environment of the palace. Yet, according to those who lived with them, they recreated the same toxicity in their new kingdom. Only now, without the checks and balances of royal aides or courtiers. In Montecito, they were the king and queen, absolute rulers, and everyone else lived in fear. But fear doesn't stay bottled forever. It spreads. It festers. It leaks out in unexpected ways. The nanny said the tension built up like a storm cloud above the house. Everyone felt it. Everyone braced for the lightning strike. And then, one night, it came. Because the household didn't just exist in fear. It eventually witnessed an incident so shocking, so chaotic, that the whispers of terror turned into screams. It was the midnight incident. Have you ever felt the air in a house change? That strange, electric stillness right before something snaps? That's what the nanny said Montecito felt like the night of the incident. The midnight incident. The one that changed everything. The one that made her realize she couldn't ignore the signs anymore. It started, as so many storms do, with something small. A child's cry. Lilibet, restless in her crib, woke up past midnight. Harmless, innocent, a sound every parent has heard. But in that mansion, where silence was prized and control was everything, the cry was treated as rebellion. The nanny said she was already awake. She heard the baby's sobs carry through the hallways, sharp and piercing in the stillness of night. She got up to soothe her, but before she could reach the nursery, she heard footsteps. Heavy, rushed, angry. It was Harry. The nanny froze in the hallway as she listened. She said his voice erupted first. Not soothing, not gentle, explosive. "Why won't you just sleep?" he shouted. The walls carried his voice, echoing down the corridor. The baby's cries grew louder, more panicked, as if she could feel the fury pouring over her. Then Meghan's voice joined, sharp, cutting, accusing. "You're doing it wrong. You always do it wrong." The nanny described the sound of chaos. Two adults shouting over a crying baby, their anger bouncing off each other, feeding the fire. She said it wasn't parenting. It was war. Harry's voice, raw with frustration. Meghan's voice, icy and merciless. The baby's cries, desperate and terrified. And then came the sound that silenced the staff. A loud crash. Something heavy slamming against the wall. The nanny swore she felt the floor vibrate beneath her feet. She didn't know if it was a thrown object, a slammed door, or worse. But the crying stopped, not because the child was soothed, but because fear had stolen her voice. The nanny said her heart raced. Every instinct screamed at her to run into the room, to scoop the child into her arms. But she didn't move. She couldn't. Fear held her still. She was just an employee, standing in the dark, torn between duty and survival. If I go in, she thought, I might lose my job. If I don't go in, I might lose my soul. Minutes passed like hours. The house seemed to hold its breath. Then, silence. Thick, suffocating silence. The kind of silence that follows destruction. The kind of silence where everyone knows something is broken, even if no one will admit it. But it wasn't just the nanny who heard it. Staff whispered later that they had all felt it. The security team, the housekeepers in the servants' quarters, even the gardener who lived in the guest house. Everyone knew something had happened that night. Something they weren't supposed to talk about. Something that couldn't be undone. The next morning, Meghan appeared in the kitchen with her usual composure. Dressed immaculately, her face calm, her voice steady. She gave instructions for the day as if nothing had happened. Harry followed later, eyes bloodshot, silence hanging over him like a shroud. The children were quiet. Too quiet. Archie avoided eye contact. Lilibet clung to her nanny without a sound. And here's the contradiction again. Hours later, the couple was photographed smiling in town, holding hands, presenting the image of perfect happiness. Can you see the irony? The world saw radiant smiles, while the people inside Montecito still heard the echo of midnight screams. The nanny described that night as the breaking point. She realized this wasn't just about strict parenting or bad tempers. It was about fear. Real fear. Fear that silenced babies. Fear that paralyzed staff. Fear that spread through every room of the house like smoke from a fire no one dared put out. She said the staff whispered about it for weeks. Some claimed Harry had thrown something. A lamp, maybe a chair. Others believed Meghan had slammed the door so hard the frame cracked. No one knew for certain. But everyone agreed on one thing. The children weren't just living in a strict household. They were living in chaos. And chaos demands cover-up. Because after the midnight incident, the rules inside the mansion didn't loosen, they tightened. Staff were warned to stay quiet, to keep their heads down, to say nothing of what they'd heard. Conversations were monitored. Instructions grew sharper. Smiles were forced more often, especially in front of outsiders. It wasn't just about controlling the children anymore. It was about controlling the narrative. The nanny said she felt a chill every time she walked past the nursery after that night. She couldn't erase the sound of the crash, the silence that followed, the way the air in the house seemed permanently heavier. She said it was the moment the illusion shattered completely for her. The fairy tale was dead. The dream was gone. All that was left was fear, denial, and secrets. But secrets don't stay buried forever. And in Montecito, they began to leak. First in whispers, then in patterns, then in stories too consistent to ignore. Because what happened at midnight couldn't be erased. It could only be covered up. What happens when the truth is too ugly to face? You bury it. You polish it. You hide it behind carefully constructed walls of perfection. That's exactly what the nanny said Harry and Meghan did after the midnight incident. It wasn't about healing. It wasn't about change. It was about control. Control of the narrative, control of appearances, control of anyone who dared to question what was happening behind those mansion gates. The nanny explained how swiftly the household shifted after that night. Almost overnight, new rules were introduced. Staff were reminded of confidentiality agreements. Meetings were held where Meghan emphasized discretion and loyalty. But let's be honest. Those were just code words for silence. Staff were told not to discuss household matters, not even with each other. Whispers had to stop. Questions had to vanish. The walls of Montecito were no longer just stone and plaster. They were walls of secrecy. And secrecy is a dangerous thing, isn't it? Because the more you hide, the more you reveal. The nanny remembered how Meghan intensified her control over the image they projected to the world. Every photo of Archie and Lilibet had to be staged with precision. Matching outfits, carefully chosen backgrounds, smiles rehearsed until they were picture perfect. Harry, meanwhile, doubled down on his devoted father persona in public appearances. He spoke about protecting his children, shielding them from the press, breaking generational trauma. The irony was unbearable. How could he preach about protection when, according to the nanny, The children had no safe haven inside their own home. But the cover-up didn't stop with photos. Meghan and Harry became experts at spinning stories. If Archie appeared withdrawn, it was explained as shyness. If Lilibet seemed clingy, it was framed as adorable attachment. Meghan crafted anecdotes in interviews, stories about bedtime routines, about the joys of parenthood, that bore no resemblance to what the nanny saw daily. And the public lapped it up, believing every word, because why wouldn't they? Who would dare accuse the Sussexes of being anything less than perfect parents? The staff, though, knew the truth. They whispered behind closed doors, careful not to be overheard. Some began keeping notes, quietly documenting incidents, perhaps for their own sanity, perhaps as insurance against the inevitable day the truth might surface. The nanny said she saw one housekeeper slip a notebook into her bag after a long day. Pages filled with scribbled observations, the kind of notes someone makes when they're too afraid to speak, but too horrified to forget. And here's where it gets darker. The nanny claimed there were deliberate attempts to erase evidence. Broken objects from Harry's outbursts were replaced swiftly, sometimes overnight. Staff were instructed never to photograph anything inside the home unless given explicit permission. Security cameras in certain areas were reportedly disabled or restricted. The household wasn't just secretive, it was actively scrubbing its own reality clean. But covering up chaos comes at a cost. The more the Sussexes tried to hide, the more pressure mounted on the staff. The nanny recalled Meghan berating a cleaner for leaving a streak on a mirror, insisting it reflected badly on the family image. A mirror streak. That was the level of paranoia. Harry once accused a driver of inviting suspicion simply because he parked the car slightly crooked in the driveway, visible from the street. The fear of exposure became obsessive, consuming every detail of daily life. And the children? They learned the script too. The nanny noticed how Archie, barely old enough to understand, began parroting phrases about being good for the cameras. He'd smile on cue when Meghan asked, but the moment the lens turned away, his face would fall. Lilibet, too, seemed conditioned to stay still during photos, like a doll positioned for display. The nanny said it broke her heart, children learning to perform before they even learned to play freely. Now, let's ask the hard question. Who were Harry and Meghan hiding the truth from? The public? The press? Or themselves? Because a cover-up isn't just for outsiders. It's also a way of denying reality to yourself. If you can convince the world you're perfect, maybe you can convince yourself. But denial only works for so long. The nanny said cracks began to appear in the carefully constructed facade. At public events, staff noticed tension in Meghan's jaw, the way Harry's hand twitched when reporters asked about the children. Behind the smiles were teeth clenched in desperation. Even friends of the couple began to sense something wasn't right. One visitor reportedly left Montecito unsettled, telling staff privately, "There's something strange about the way those kids act. Too quiet, too rehearsed." And here's the thing about secrets. They demand accomplices. The nanny believed that part of the reason the Sussexes kept staff turnover so high was to prevent anyone from knowing too much. Fresh faces couldn't see patterns. New employees couldn't connect dots. But those who stayed longer, they saw everything. And some of them began to talk. Quietly, carefully, to trusted confidants. Which raises another question. How long can a cover-up last before someone decides the truth is worth the risk? Because the nanny wasn't the only one to notice. She wasn't the only one keeping silent out of fear. And she wasn't the only one beginning to feel that silence was becoming unbearable. And soon, the cracks in the facade didn't just show, they widened. The whispers traveled farther. The royal family in London began hearing things. Rumors, concerns, warnings. Because even the tightest cover-up can't silence the truth forever. Have you ever looked at a photo and wondered what was hiding just outside the frame? That's the question the nanny kept asking herself every time she saw Meghan and Harry step out in public with dazzling smiles, impeccable outfits, and that carefully polished glow of family unity. To the world, they looked like the picture of happiness. But to those who lived inside Montecito, those appearances felt like elaborate performances, staged to mask the dysfunction boiling behind closed doors. The contrast was almost surreal. Hours after the midnight incident, where shouting, crashing, and silence left the house trembling, Meghan was photographed on the streets of Santa Barbara in a casual chic outfit, holding Harry's hand, smiling as if she had just stepped out of a rom-com. No one looking at that photo would have guessed the tension still hanging in the air at home. Isn't that the cruel genius of public image? The ability to convince the world that perfection exists while chaos festers in the shadows. The nanny remembered watching Meghan prepare for outings. Every detail was rehearsed. The outfit, the accessories, the children's appearances, nothing was left to chance. Archie's curls had to sit just so. Lilibet's shoes had to match her dress. Even the way the children were carried or walked was scripted. Meghan instructed the nanny on how to position the children if photographers were near, down to the angle of Archie's head tilt or the placement of Lilibet's hand. They need to look comfortable, Meghan said once, according to the nanny. Comfortable. As if comfort could be choreographed. Harry, too, played his part. In public, he was the doting father, the protective husband. He'd kneel beside Archie for a staged whisper or toss a playful grin at Lilibet. The nanny said those moments always felt hollow, like lines rehearsed for a play. She saw the difference. The warmth that was broadcast outside never lasted at home. The moment the cameras vanished, the tension crept back in like fog rolling over the hills. And yet the public believed it. They saw photos of a smiling family on a sunny California afternoon. They watched interviews where Meghan spoke about motherhood being both beautiful and challenging. They read stories about Harry's desire to protect his children from the mistakes of the past. And who would question that? After all, hadn't they risked everything to leave the royal family in search of freedom? Hadn't they been painted as victims of an archaic institution? The nanny described the irony as unbearable. Harry and Meghan had fled the palace because they said life there was a performance. Yet in Montecito, they created an even bigger stage. The roles were reversed. The monarchy had been replaced by Hollywood. Instead of courtiers, they had PR teams. Instead of duty to the crown, they had duty to the brand. And at the center of it all, two children forced to play their parts. She gave an example that still haunted her. One afternoon, a professional photographer was invited to capture candid family moments in the garden. Meghan orchestrated everything: the picnic blanket, the fruit bowls, the matching neutral-toned outfits. The children were instructed to laugh on cue. The nanny, standing nearby, watched as Archie forced a giggle, eyes darting nervously to his parents for approval. Lilibet sat stiffly in Meghan's lap, her smile flickering in and out like a light bulb about to burn out. The resulting photos? Perfect. Magazine-worthy. The reality? Hollow. But not all cracks could be hidden. The nanny said she noticed small signs leaking into the public image. Archie rarely smiled naturally in candid shots. His eyes often seemed distant, his posture rigid. Lilibet clung too tightly to whoever carried her, as if afraid to be set down. To the average observer, these details might look like shyness or temperament. But to someone who knew the inside story, they were red flags waving furiously. And then there were the events where Harry and Meghan themselves couldn't maintain the illusion. The nanny recalled one gala where Meghan appeared radiant in photos, but staff whispered that she had lashed out at Harry minutes before stepping out of the car. Harry's smile, wide for the cameras, never touched his eyes. Those who looked closely could see the tension in his clenched jaw, the stiffness in his stance. But the public? They saw glamour. They saw unity. They saw the performance. Doesn't that make you wonder how much of what we see is ever real? How many public smiles are masks hiding private wounds? The nanny admitted she sometimes felt complicit. She helped dress the children. She ensured they looked tidy, smiling, presentable. She walked beside them at events, holding her tongue, forcing her own smile for the sake of appearances. Inside, though, she carried guilt. Every time I saw those photos later, she said, I felt like I was helping to sell a lie. And the lie wasn't just for the public. It was for the royal family, too. Reports began filtering back to London. Concerns about the children, rumors of household tension. Meghan and Harry responded with staged calls and carefully curated Zoom appearances. Meghan would hold Lilibet on her lap. Harry would wave Archie into the frame, and they'd present the image of domestic bliss. But those who had lived through the Windsor machine weren't fooled so easily. Palace aides began to whisper, and royals themselves began to ask questions. Because image can hide truth only for so long. Eventually, reality claws its way through the cracks. And when the cracks grew wider, when whispers turned into direct concerns, the nanny said something happened that shook her even more than the midnight incident. Because the truth of Montecito didn't just stay within the staff. It began to ripple outward, reaching ears that Harry and Meghan couldn't silence. Have you ever tried to hide a secret so heavy that no matter how carefully you cover it, someone eventually notices the weight pressing down? That's exactly what happened in Montecito. For a while, Harry and Meghan's iron grip on image control worked. The photos fooled the public. The interviews dazzled the press. The stage smiles satisfied the casual onlookers. But behind the palace walls thousands of miles away, whispers were growing. The royal family was starting to hear the cracks in the facade. And those whispers weren't just coming from tabloids. They were coming from people who had seen too much, lived too close, and couldn't keep silent forever. The nanny recalled how it began with subtle questions. She overheard Meghan on the phone with someone in London, her voice calm but sharp, fielding inquiries about Archie's unusual quietness during a video call with a relative. "He's just shy," Meghan insisted. But the nanny said she could hear the strain in Meghan's tone, the clipped edge of someone pushing back against doubt. Then came the staff connections. Remember, many of the workers in Montecito weren't random hires. They had histories in royal households, private estates, and diplomatic circles. These weren't people unfamiliar with discretion, but they were also not blind. Word travels, especially among those who once served the crown. A driver who had once worked in Kensington, a housekeeper with ties to Sandringham, a security consultant with palace connections. Quietly, carefully, reports began to reach London. Something isn't right in Montecito. And isn't that inevitable? The couple who spent years branding themselves as the victims of royal coldness suddenly looked like the cold ones themselves. The irony stung. The nanny remembered the day Prince William's name first came up in hushed tones among staff. One housekeeper claimed she overheard Meghan fuming about spying relatives after receiving word that William had been making inquiries through trusted aides. Could it be true? Would William really risk meddling in his brother's private household? Or was it concern born from guilt, from the bond of two brothers raised in trauma? Either way, the message was clear. The royals were worried. The nanny painted an even sharper picture. She said there were moments when the children's behavior during family calls raised eyebrows. Archie, asked by his grandfather Charles about school, gave only clipped one-word answers, eyes downcast. Lilibet, coaxed to wave at the camera, clung silently to Meghan's shoulder, face half hidden. Small signs, maybe, but royals know how to read signals. They've lived their whole lives behind veils. They can spot when something feels off. And the concerns weren't only about the children. Staff whispers reached London describing Harry's temper, the midnight shouting, the daytime explosions, the constant volatility. Aides who once managed Diana's sons reportedly exchanged knowing looks. "He's more like Charles than he realizes," one allegedly said. That irony wasn't lost on anyone. Harry, who publicly criticized his father's parenting, now being whispered about in the same breath. The nanny admitted she sometimes saw hints of guilt flicker across Harry's face when he spoke with his family. A slight twitch in his expression when William's name came up. A defensiveness in his tone when Charles asked gentle questions. But instead of opening up, Harry doubled down. He insisted his home was his sanctuary, his family was thriving, his children were happy. The more they asked, the harder he pushed back. But Meghan? The nanny said Meghan viewed royal concern as intrusion. She reportedly snapped once, "They don't get to tell me how to raise my children." To her, every whisper from London wasn't worry, it was control. It was the monarchy's shadow creeping back into the life she thought she had escaped. And Meghan wasn't about to let that happen. Still, the royals kept watching. Aides began quietly keeping track of staff turnover in Montecito, noting the alarming rate at which nannies, assistants, and housekeepers came and went. For a family obsessed with stability and protocol, the chaos was a red flag. Why couldn't Harry and Meghan keep people? What was driving them away? And here's where the contradictions became unbearable. Publicly, Meghan preached compassion, community, and wellness. Privately, staff described humiliation, fear, and suffocation. Publicly, Harry railed against his father's failures as a parent. Privately, he repeated those same patterns with his own children. The royals didn't need paparazzi to tell them something was wrong. The truth was seeping in through trusted channels. The nanny remembered one particular day. A letter arrived, official, bearing a royal crest. Meghan read it in the study, her jaw tightening with every line.